You know, one thing I tend to hear from people on YouTube a lot is that they can't believe that I actually carry a revolver for self-defense. Now, of course, these people tend to be the more tactical type of people, but they tend to have two problems with the revolver. They say it doesn't have a high enough capacity and it's too slow to reload. You can't do a quick tactical reload on a revolver very easily. Well, to those people, I want to say, get over yourself. Worrying about things like that, something that is so unlikely to have any effect on you as a civilian firearms owner, is just ridiculous. Especially the idea of tactical reloads for civilian gun carriers. It's just kind of silly. This notion that this is something you should be worried about, it just defies all logic. Most police officers have never had to do a tactical reload under fire. The vast majority, almost none of them. I mean, just do some research and find out. But most of them have never even had to reload their gun. And if they ever have had to reload their gun, they usually did it from cover because they had enough sense to get the cover first before they emptied their firearm at someone. Heck, the way we do warfare nowadays, even most military people have never done tactical reloads under fire. That's why we do things the way we do. That's why we utilize cover. That's why we have cover fire, etc. So you don't have to do that. So to go around pretending that these tactical guys that like to say it's important are somehow in the know or actually know what they're talking about, it's just kind of silly. And as far as capacity goes, most people who carry a gun as a civilian are never going to even have to draw that weapon. And of that tiny little fraction of people that do have to draw their weapon, only a tiny little fraction of that tiny little fraction are ever going to have to fire it. In fact, like 90 to 93% of the times people use a gun for self-defense, they don't even have to fire it. Just presenting it is enough. And of the people that do have to fire it, that tiny little fraction of a tiny little fraction of a tiny little fraction, they usually only have to fire their gun once. And on average, the most they fire is three rounds. So you can see capacity really isn't that big of a concern. It might be a very remote concern, but it definitely isn't high on the list. Now, I know some people are going to say, oh, I remember this fight in Detroit where 90 shots were fired. Yeah, from 15 gang members all shooting at each other and no one or maybe one or two people actually get hit out of all those rounds fired. Hardly an ideal example of what civilian concealed carriers should be worried about. Or they'll use a story like, oh, I remember this guy who fought off 5 armed home invaders because home invaders are coming in big numbers now with guns, and he fought them off with an AR because he had lots of rounds. But then they fail to research it and find out, well, that was a drug lord, and that was a rival gang raiding his house, and he was prepared for them, which is why he had cameras everywhere and an AR in his hands when they came in. Once again, hardly applicable to your daily life, hardly an example of what you need to prepare for. Now, I know some people are going to say, well, I've never heard anyone say they wish they had fewer rounds in a gunfight. Well, I've never heard anyone say they wish they had more rounds in a gunfight. Either their gun was sufficient or it wasn't. And 99.99% of the time, that gun is going to be sufficient. But you know, there is one thing as far as capacity is concerned that we can quantify. One thing we actually can see happening and count it happening. And that's the number of people that lose a gunfight and lose their life that still had rounds in their gun. Plenty of rounds left over because they didn't make the rounds they fired count. This whole notion that the number of rounds in your firearm is what determines how successful you're going to be in a fight or how long you can actually stay in the fight, that is just stupid. It's how well you use the rounds you do fire that matter far more. In fact, when it comes to considering your carry gun, there are things that are far more important than capacity that a lot of people ignore. Like one is, will you actually carry that gun? If you're not going to carry it, it doesn't matter if that big old bulky gun holds 20 rounds. If it's at home in the drawer, it's not doing you any good. And it has to be reliable. If it's not reliable, what good is it? You don't want to have a gun that isn't going to work when you need it. So it has to be reliable. Now, a lot of people will say reliable should come before, will you carry it? That should be the number one thing. I don't think so. Because if you don't carry it, it doesn't matter how reliable it is. You also have to take into consideration how capable of a round is it? Will it do the job? Will it stop the threat? Like if you're going out in the bear country, you're not going to carry a 22. It doesn't matter if you shoot him 50 times with a 22. It matters if you shoot him once or twice with a 44. So make sure your round is capable of doing the job you need it to do. And most importantly, the most important thing when you determine whether a round is capable is if you can actually hit your target. If you can't hit your target with that great big bulky gun, it's not going to do you any good no matter what caliber it is. Choose the gun that you can actually hit your target with. To me, that's the most important thing, not capacity by a long shot. And as far as tactics are concerned, things like tactical reloads are so far down the list that to worry about them is kind of silly. If you want to worry about them, that's great. But if you're someone who worries about tactical reloads, you better be wearing a special helmet because you're far more likely to die from falling and hitting your head than you are from being killed in a firefight because you couldn't reload your handgun quickly enough. So unless you're wearing a special helmet, I don't want to hear from you about tactical reloads and how we should consider it. And if you are wearing a helmet, there's other things you should consider first. Like being aware of your surroundings. Don't be in a situation where you don't know how to get out if you have to get out. Just pay attention, look around. That's very important. And as far as your handgun is concerned, when it comes to tactics, one of the most important things you need to know is how to get it from your holster to your hand when you need it the most. That's far more important than knowing how to reload it quickly. Also, know how to use cover. Know how to fight and move. Know where cover is and get to it as quickly as possible. That greatly increases your chances of surviving a firefight. Being in a position where you can shoot them but they can't shoot you, that's far more important than how many rounds you have. But the number one thing you can do is just don't take unnecessary risks. Don't put yourself in dangerous situations just because you think you can handle it. Always be aware of where you're at, what could happen, and be prepared to deal with it. And if something is too risky, don't do it. So as you can see, there's lots of things that are very important when it comes to choosing your carry gun and practicing your tactics. But capacity and tactical reloads are so far down on the list that you better be worrying about a lot of other things first. And you definitely shouldn't be telling other people that they're doing it wrong if they aren't considering those very remote and unimportant things. In fact, they might be doing it far more right than you are if you're putting capacity and tactical reloads above other things that should be a much greater concern to you. That's kind of dumb. It kind of doesn't make any sense. And that's people who lose a gun fit their life, who still have plenty of rounds in their bullets. Who still had plenty of ammunition in their... Oh! Practice that far more than you practice track. They have more trouble shooting you to it. That greatly increases...